Rock Island is a state park located on Lake Michigan at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin. It's a difficult place to get to. You have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island, drive across to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry from there to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed there. Though the island is relatively small, about 975 acres, it has a rather interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups didn't trust each other and did have a few bad encounters that nearly led to violence, but for the most part, they coexisted peacefully. By the 1640s, the Native Americans had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after their departure, some settlers reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They appeared to be more white settlers. However, they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to speak with one of these new settlers, or even find where they were living. It was around that time that strange things began to happen. Livestock, it's not mentioned which animals, were found slaughtered in the village. Blood was found marking some of the buildings in the village. On a different night, a building used for meat preservation burned to the ground. The villagers felt that these actions must have been taken by these new people. They intended to find them. After a thorough search of the entire island, though, including the wooded inland area, not a single person was found. The strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the settlers were ever seen again. In 1836, a lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, it was inspected, and the report read, "The material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are of the best quality, and the work was done in a substantive and workmanlike manner." David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light on December 19, 1837. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of the construction of the lighthouse, Corbin began complaining of plaster falling from the building and that some sort of liquid would ooze through cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was totally alone most of the time in the lighthouse. Some said that when visiting him he would stare at a certain wall, and sometimes spoke vaguely of the other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse keeper and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was behaving strangely. The official report says that the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a new wife to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by Corbin's mental state after the years of isolation and thought it would be best that he spend some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the structure. The next lighthouse keeper also reported the surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends, having visited the new keeper at his dwelling, said that he would talk of seeing things in the house at night, but would not elaborate on what it was that he had seen. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or family member stay with them. No odd events were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, with the exception of January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote that a terrible storm came up shortly after their departure, and that they had never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3rd, 1876, Betts wrote, "The 2 men who were lost last January have been seen several times. Once from Caney Lighthouse, and once from Jacksonport. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account, they were still adrift. There is not much hope that they will be found and buried." By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas. In 1910, a successful business owner and investor named Chester Thorderson purchased all of the island, with the exception of the land occupied by the lighthouse. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thorderson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that remain on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall containing a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was constructed on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was erected to the west. The great hall was used as a library to store Thorderson's immense book collection. He owned over 11,000 books, and it's rumored that his collection included some very rare volumes on the occult. Thorderson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, and some have speculated that he actually saw something which scared him to death. The history I've provided here has been to give context for the experiences that I myself have had, directly or indirectly, on Rock Island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip there. After taking the 2 ferry rides, I arrived at around 2 p.m. I had booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that's a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time enjoying the scenery on the hike to the camp's location, taking a couple of breaks also due to the weight of my pack. I was definitely packed more than necessary for camping. I got to the site and set up my tent, got everything situated. I then began gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach to start a fire. On my 3rd trip back from the beach, before I got back to my site, I heard a single, high-pitched, squealing sound coming from the forest. It wasn't close, but it was so unusual that I stopped in my tracks, waiting and listening to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued my trek back. When I returned, I started working on getting the fire going. The remote camping sites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each one. There's no real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between them to have made an obvious path. As I was setting up sticks in my fire ring, something caught my eye, and I looked up. A fair distance away, it could have been at Site D or a bit further, there was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it wasn't even really a trail that they were on. Then my mind went to, there must be something wrong, that this person must need my help. They got a little closer, and it looked like maybe it was a woman in loose gray clothes, maybe wearing a hoodie. It was still too far away for me to be able to make out any real details. I quickly rose from the crouching position that I was in, and just as I did, I heard that high-pitched noise again. It was behind me, and it was much closer this time. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around to look behind me. I scanned the trees for a couple seconds, but didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around, thinking that the running person must be getting close, but now they were gone. Again, I stood there and scanned the trees. They were nowhere to be seen. I was so confused that I stood frozen there for a few moments. It was all very weird, but I was able to reason it out in my head that it must have been a fellow camper from Site C or D who had been running for the pit toilet located a couple hundred yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it, but it was really bothering me. I did not like whatever that noise was, and I just felt really off about the entire thing. After some effort, I let it go and got my campfire going. I ate a quick meal and drank a few beers, then decided to go for a little walk. I hadn't been to Site C or D yet, so I thought that I would check them out, see if I did have some neighbors camping close by. Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from the site to the main trail and pit toilet, so that made me feel a little less uneasy. I figured it was maybe someone from Site C who took a wrong turn and wound up taking the long way around by going through Site D to get to the main trail. It didn't make a ton of sense, because I probably still should have seen them, but it still made me feel a little bit better. I continued on to Site C and saw that there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I thought I would go over with the excuse that I would introduce myself as their camping neighbor and see if anyone looked like they might have been the runner from before. I came up to the site and saw a couple sitting at a picnic table. Neither of them appeared to be the person that I had seen. We went through our social formalities, introducing ourselves to each other. They were probably in their mid-30s, both very nice and both very drunk, but quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or the noises. I thought it might be weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got there, I smoked a cigar and had a few more drinks. It was getting dark. It started out as a perfect night. The sky was clear, and I just hung out looking up at the millions of stars hovering above. I felt calmer about everything and decided to get some sleep. It had been a long day, so I passed out almost instantly. At nearly 2:30 a.m., I was awoken by a huge boom of thunder. The sky had begun pouring rain. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I do not love camping in a lightning storm. I was beginning to worry. The wind was whipping around my tent, and the ground shook from the thunder and lightning. I didn't feel great about being out there in a tent, so exposed. The storm only lasted for another hour, though, before it turned into a light, steady drizzle, and I was beginning to doze off. Just as I was nearly asleep, though, I heard the squealing noise yet again. I opened my eyes wide and lay there silent in the dark. Then came another noise, this time much closer. I knew there were no really dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are deer, porcupine, but nothing like bear or wolves. Still, knowing that didn't do anything to reassure me. There was just something about that sound that made me incredibly uneasy, even paranoid. I keep calling it a squeal as well because that's the best description that I have for it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. I honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured, angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent and started hearing footsteps outside. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried in the sound of the rain, but it definitely sounded like a large animal or another human that was walking around. I sat up and took out my knife. In my head, I kept telling myself that it was fine, that there was nothing in those woods that could hurt me. I listened as the footsteps started moving away. Then I just sat there, still holding my knife, for about 10 minutes without hearing anything. I kept internally telling myself that it was just an animal, everything was fine, and that I was being stupid because I just needed to get more sleep. Just as I was about to lay back down, however, there was yet another squeal. This one was very loud and very close. as in right outside my tent. It felt as though my heart just stopped then and there, and a shiver went down my spine. My heart beat so hard that I felt my pulse through my entire body and could hear the blood rushing in my ears. It took everything in me to force the words, "Get out of here," from my mouth. I didn't shout, but tried to be as stern and mean-sounding as I could in the moment. I didn't hear any more footsteps or squeals that night, but I also couldn't sleep. I just laid there in the tent until eventually the rain stopped and the sun rose into the sky. All the time I kept reassuring myself and at the same time telling myself that I had to be being stupid. It had to be just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided that I had to get up to relieve myself. As soon as I unzipped the tent flaps and stepped out, I saw that the site's picnic table had been flipped upside down. When I saw this, I was surprisingly calm in my reaction. I simply thought, okay, this is enough, I'm leaving the island today. I checked my surroundings. Nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned that the wind had blown the table over during the previous night's storm. It still seemed weird, though, because the table was heavy, and I felt like I would have heard it being turned over. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat. I started feeling better again, so I decided to go for a hike. I must admit, I get pretty easily scared when I'm camping in the woods by myself. Maybe that's natural. After breakfast and getting a bit of sun, I realized that nothing I heard was really anything that couldn't be explained. Other than not getting a good night's sleep, I was having a pretty good time. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike the 7-mile Thorderson's Loop Trail. It has a lot of interesting things to see, and I was excited to get going. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site was the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked, or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked as though it had been used recently. A bit further down the trail was a cemetery. It's known that 2 sisters and a few others are buried there, but it's also believed that there are more unmarked graves. They were likely some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. One is by the beach, and that's where Chester Thorderson is buried. One is on the eastern part of the island, where the 2 sisters are buried. And one is on the northern part of the island, where the original lighthouse keeper David E. Corbin is buried. There's also at least one Native American burial ground on the island. However, no one knows exactly where it is. I kept walking until I came to a nice scenic overlook area with a bench where I sat down and drank some water. That's when I heard someone talking on the trail ahead of me, though I couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail, and the trees were thick. I sat on the bench waiting for the people to appear. The voices were coming closer, and I could tell that they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place what language that it might have been. Both voices were very deep, guttural. Then, from deep in the woods, I heard a loud call. Immediately, both of the voices I was listening to responded with a call of their own. I kind of smiled because it sounded like they were mocking whatever had made the sound in the forest. I got off the bench, put my backpack back on, and started walking further down the trail from them. I never actually saw the people, though. The rest of the hike went well. I visited the grave of David E. Corbin. I took a self-guided tour of the lighthouse. I passed by a wooden gate that seemed to have been used as part of a larger structure. Next, I went past the Great Hall and dock area from where I had arrived on the island and visited some of the other structures. Next, I came across the cemetery housing the body of Thorderson himself. And finally, I finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike, with a lot to see, and it wasn't especially difficult, but still, I was tired. I did go down to Camp C and ask the couple from the night before about how they had fared during the storm, but they had already packed up and left. I was disappointed because I'd also considered asking them whether they had heard the squealing noises. The rest of the evening was uneventful. I built a fire, made a meal, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed, especially after having had so little sleep the night before. I got inside my tent and quickly faded out of consciousness. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours when I woke up suddenly, instantly alert. Nothing that I was aware of had caused me to wake up, but I felt that something was wrong. I sat up, and this part of what happened is difficult to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if something or someone was inside that tent with me, and I could feel its anger, its seething rage, its hatred of me. Something very bad was about to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell in the air, that of garbage or rotten meat. It was so strong that I wanted to throw up. I couldn't even move, though. I was frozen, and even weirder is that I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. Like my brain was telling me that whatever was about to occur, even if it were death, that it would at least be relief. Then I passed out. At least, I have to assume that I passed out. That's all I remember anyway, until waking up around 8 the next morning. I opened my eyes to discover that I was laying outside my sleeping bag on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back, with my left leg straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was up against my left knee. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself that it was a dream, and that I was leaving right then. I packed up very quickly and started off toward the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since it wouldn't be arriving until 10:30, I had a little time to kill around the Great Hall and dock area. I wanted to get away from that place badly, but I did feel a smidge better just being out of the woods where I could see other people. I sat down on a bench, a little to the east of the dock, and lit a cigar, just giving myself something to do while trying not to think of the night before. I was sitting a few minutes, scanning out over the water, when I was startled by someone saying, "Hi!" I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around apologizing, saying that they were just wanting to ask whether I had a lighter. I felt like an idiot, and told him that it was fine, that I just hadn't had much sleep. I tossed him my lighter and he lit a cigarette, then gave it back, and we began chit-chatting about the usual things that you would discuss with strangers. Where we were both from, the weather, and so on. It was a nice, normal conversation, and he seemed like a pretty nice guy. Naturally, in the course of our talking, he asked about which campsite that I had stayed at. I told him, and in response he explained that whenever he books a site, he comes to the island and chooses whichever spot that he wants, because the site requires the stay to be booked, but that you can actually camp wherever you want to because it isn't monitored. He told me that he comes to the island a few times a year, and that once he found a small log house in the woods. That his plan was to attempt and find that location again and camp inside the cabin. After my personal experience with only one time camping on the island under my belt, I kind of wanted to change the subject, to be honest. Then he asked if I had heard the screeching sounds. I knew that he was talking about the squealing. I told him that I had, and asked if he knew what it was. It took a second for him to reply, and when he did, I saw his face change. He had this expression on his face as if he were debating whether or not he should tell me, as if it were some kind of secret. Then, in a calm and matter-of-fact manner, he told me, A demon lives on this island. Under any other circumstance, I would have laughed him all the way back to the mainland. Not after what I had heard and felt, though. He looked at me and must have sensed my anxiety and fear, because he gave a quick laugh, asking me if I had seen anything at night. I told him that I hadn't, and he stared at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. I felt like he could tell that I was lying, that I had, in fact, experienced something. At this point, I was officially ready for the conversation to be over. Then he told me that he had seen something in the cemetery in the dark. His face and mood changed again, like he was now trying to confide in me. I didn't want to ask what had happened, but I knew that he wanted me to, so I did, and when I spoke, my voice came out shaky. I could tell he changed his mind then about sharing with me. He actually looked at me with empathy instead, and told me that it was hard for him to explain. That if I was afraid of the screeching noises, though, that I probably shouldn't go near the cemeteries. I didn't respond right away, and then he said these 4 words completely without context or explanation. Keepers of the Flame. I looked down at my cigar, ashed it, and put it out, and told him that I was going to wait by the dock for the ferry. He nodded, and I started walking away. After a few steps, he called out to me, and I turned to look at him. "Don't come back here," he said. I turned back, continuing to walk away from him. I don't know if his words were a friendly suggestion or a warning, but I took them to heart. I am definitely not going back to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame as it pertained to Rock Island. I found 3 things the mysterious stranger could have been referring to. The name of the Native American tribe who once lived on the island could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers on the island were also referred to as Keepers of the Flame. And then, there was a 19th century cult said to visit the island from time to time, who called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails, and exploring the buildings. I can only say that in my humble opinion, if you've never paid the island a visit, stay away.